"Dad, they are still alive." His only daughter told a Hell's Angel what he found changed his life forever. The neon sign of Mike's Bar flickered weakly through the grimy windows, casting intermittent red shadows across Jack's weathered face. His calloused fingers traced the rim of his half-empty whiskey glass, the amber liquid untouched for the past 20 minutes. The bar's dingy interior matched his mood, dark, worn, and forgotten. Country music crackled through ancient speakers, barely audible over the clinking of bottles and mumbled conversations. Jack hardly noticed. His mind wandered to the same place it always did after a few drinks, to his father's face, the last time he'd seen it. 15 years had passed, but the memory remained sharp as broken glass. "Another round?" The bartender's gruff voice cut through his thoughts. Jack shook his head, his leather jacket creaking as he shifted on the wooden bar stool. A faded patch on his back displayed his allegiance, the colors of the Hell's Angels he'd worn for the past decade. The life had given him purpose, filled the void his father left behind. At least, that's what he told himself. "Waste of time," he muttered, thinking of the latest dead-end lead he'd followed. Every few years, someone would claim to have seen his old man, and every time, it led nowhere. The gang had its theories: rival club hit, drug deal gone wrong, witness protection. Jack had stopped listening years ago. The door swung open, letting in a blast of cold air and a group of truckers. Jack tensed instinctively, scanning their faces, reading their body language. Old habits died hard, but they were just ordinary men looking for a drink after a long haul. His phone vibrated in his pocket. Unknown number. Jack almost ignored it, but something made him answer. "Yeah?" His voice was rough from disuse. "Is this Jack Morrison?" A woman's voice, clear and determined. "Who's asking?" "My name is Emma. I have information about your father, William Morrison." Jack's fingers tightened around the glass. His pulse quickened, but his voice remained steady. "My father's dead." "No, he isn't." The certainty in her tone made his stomach clench. "I know where he is, and I can prove it." "Lady, I don't know what game you're playing." "The scar on his left forearm," she interrupted. 3 parallel lines from a bar fight in '92. He got them protecting you from a drunk who came at you with a broken bottle. You were 6. Jack's breath caught. Nobody knew about that night except him and his father. He'd never told anyone, not even his closest brothers in the club. "How did you— I need to meet with you," Emma said. "Face to face. This isn't something I can explain over the phone." Jack stood up, leaving a crumpled bill under his glass. He walked outside, where the night air cleared his head slightly. "Why should I trust you?" "Because I'm the only one who can give you the answers you've been looking for." There was a pause. "Please, Jack, just meet me. 1 hour of your time, that's all I'm asking." The rational part of his mind screamed that this was a trap. But that detail about the scar, it was too specific, too personal to be a lucky guess. "Where and when?" he finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Tomorrow, noon, the diner on 4th Street, across from the public library." Jack ran a hand through his hair, conflict churning in his gut. "Fine, but if this is some kind of setup—" "It's not," Emma assured him. "I'll be there, just come alone." The line went dead, leaving Jack standing in the parking lot, staring at his phone. For the first time in 15 years, he felt something dangerous stirring in his chest. Hope. The fluorescent lights of Sally's diner buzzed overhead, casting a harsh glow on the chipped formica table where Jack sat. His fingers drummed against his coffee cup, the liquid inside growing cold and bitter. He'd arrived 30 minutes early, picked a corner booth with a clear view of both exits, and ordered coffee he hadn't touched. A waitress with graying hair and tired eyes stopped by his table for the third time. "Ready to order yet, hun?" "Still waiting on someone," Jack muttered, his eyes fixed on the entrance. The lunch crowd was starting to filter in, filling the small diner with the clatter of plates and mundane conversation. He'd left his leather jacket in the truck, wearing just a plain black t-shirt that didn't hide the tattoos crawling up his arms. A few customers gave him wary glances, quickly looking away when he caught their eyes. Jack was used to it. The sideways looks, the subtle shifting away. It was better than the alternative, someone recognizing his club affiliations. The bell above the door chimed. A businessman in a wrinkled suit. Not her. Jack checked his phone again. 11:57. His stomach churned with a mixture of anticipation and dread. Part of him hoped she wouldn't show, that he could write this off as another dead end and go back to his life of careful numbness. The bell chimed again. A woman walked in, early 30s, with dark hair pulled back in a neat ponytail. She carried herself with quiet confidence, scanning the diner with purpose. Her eyes found Jack's, and something in her gaze made him sit up straighter. She walked toward his booth with measured steps, her sensible heels clicking against the linoleum floor. No hesitation, no fear, just calm determination. "Jack?" Her voice matched the one from the phone. "I'm Emma." He gestured to the seat across from him, studying her face for any sign of deception. She slid into the booth gracefully, placing her purse beside her. The waitress appeared with fresh coffee. "Ready now?" "Just coffee for me, thanks," Emma said with a gentle smile. She waited until the waitress left before turning back to Jack. "Thank you for coming. You said you had proof." Jack's voice was low, controlled. "About my father." Emma wrapped her hands around the coffee cup, as if gathering her thoughts. "What I'm about to tell you will be hard to believe, but I need you to listen, really listen, before you make any judgments. I'm not here for games. Your father isn't dead, Jack." She said it simply, directly. "He's alive, living under the name John Martin in a small town about 3 hours from here." Jack's fingers tightened around his cup. The diner sounds faded to a distant hum. "That's impossible." "He changed his identity 15 years ago," Emma continued, her voice steady. "He left everything behind, his name, his life, his family, because he had to protect someone." "Protect someone?" Jack's laugh was harsh. "He abandoned his family. He abandoned me." Emma reached for her purse, pulling out a manila envelope. "I have recent photos, documentation of his new life, but more importantly, I have this." She slid a folded piece of paper across the table. Jack's hands shook slightly as he opened it. His father's handwriting stared back at him, as familiar as his own reflection. The letter was dated 2 weeks ago. "How?" His throat felt tight. "How did you get this?" Emma took a deep breath. "Because he's my father too, Jack. And there's something you need to know about why he disappeared." The manila envelope made a soft scratching sound as Emma pulled out a glossy photograph. Jack's hands trembled as he took it, his coffee forgotten and growing colder by the minute. The man in the photo stood in front of a small hardware store, wearing khakis and a light blue button-down shirt. His once dark hair had gone completely gray, and wire-rimmed glasses perched on his nose. Deep laugh lines creased the corners of his eyes. He looked happy, normal. Nothing like the hard-eyed man who had dominated Jack's childhood memories. "This can't be him," Jack muttered, but even as the words left his mouth, he recognized the set of his father's jaw, the way he held his shoulders. "When was this taken?" 3 weeks ago," Emma said softly. "He owns that hardware store now. Built a whole new life for himself. Jack's throat felt tight. He shoved the photo back across the table, unable to look at it anymore. Why are you showing me this? What do you want? Emma pulled out another photo, this one older and creased at the corners. It showed a younger version of his father holding a little girl with dark pigtails on his shoulders. They were both laughing at something off camera. That's me, Emma said, her finger tracing the edge of the photo. I was 7 when this was taken. It was right before everything changed. Jack stared at the photo, his mind refusing to process what he was seeing. The date stamp in the corner showed it was taken when he was 12, the same year his father disappeared. I don't understand, he said, his voice rough. Are you saying, I'm your sister, Jack, your half-sister? Emma's eyes held his, steady and earnest. Dad met my mom when I was little. They fell in love, got married. We lived in a different town, away from his other life. The diner suddenly felt too small, too crowded. Jack could hear his pulse pounding in his ears. You're lying. I wish I was. Emma's voice cracked slightly. Because then I wouldn't have to tell you that he left to protect me. A rival gang found out about us, about his secret family. They threatened to hurt me to get to him. Jack's hand clenched into a fist under the table. So he just walked away? Left me behind? He thought you'd be safer with your mom, with the club's protection. Emma leaned forward, her eyes pleading. He had to disappear completely, change everything about himself. It was the only way to keep both his families safe. Both his families, Jack repeated bitterly. You mean the secret one he chose over us? It wasn't like that, Emma protested. He lost everything that day, his identity, his life, you. Do you think that was easy for him? Jack pushed back from the table, needing space. The photos lay between them like physical manifestations of the lies he'd believed his whole life. His father wasn't dead. He hadn't been killed in some gang rivalry like Jack had always assumed. He'd been living a peaceful life in some small town, running a hardware store of all things, while Jack had grown up angry and alone. Prove it, he growled. Prove you're really his daughter. Prove any of this is true. Emma reached into her purse again, her movements deliberate and calm despite Jack's rising anger. I have more documents, birth certificates, marriage license. I don't want to see papers, Jack cut her off. I want real proof. I want to know why I should believe anything you're saying. The neon signs of downtown blurred past Jack's motorcycle as he sped through the night, his mind churning like the engine beneath him. The familiar route home did nothing to settle the chaos in his thoughts. Each traffic light gave him unwanted moments to remember those photos, his father's gentle smile, those laugh lines that had never been there before, the little girl with pigtails who was supposedly his sister. Back in his apartment, Jack paced the worn floorboards, unable to sit still. The place felt smaller than usual, cluttered with the ghosts of memories he'd tried to bury. He caught his reflection in the window. Leather vest, tattoos snaking up his arms, the hardened look that kept people at arm's length. Nothing like the clean-cut man in that photograph. Damn it, he muttered, running a hand through his hair. The beer he grabbed from the fridge did little to calm his nerves. Emma's business card sat on his kitchen counter, innocent and threatening all at once. She'd slid it across the diner table before he'd stormed out, her neat handwriting on the back listing her cell number. Jack picked up the card, turning it over in his fingers. A social worker. Of course she was. Probably spent her days helping people, fixing broken families. The complete opposite of everything he'd become. His phone felt heavy in his hand as he pulled it out. The screen lit up, showing 3 missed calls from his club brothers. Usually he'd jump to return them, but tonight was different. He found himself typing Emma's number instead. She answered on the second ring. Jack? That hardware store, he said, skipping any greeting. Where is it? A pause. In Vermont, a little town called Miller's Creek. Vermont? Jack barked out a harsh laugh. What? He couldn't get far enough away. Jack, I know this is hard. You don't know anything about me. He gripped the phone tighter. But I want answers. Real ones. Not some story about protection and sacrifice. I understand. Emma's voice remained steady, patient. I have an address. A P.O. box he used 6 months ago. It might lead somewhere. Jack took a long breath, forcing down the anger that always seemed to simmer just below the surface. Why are you doing this? Why now? Because he's our father, Emma said simply, and because I think he wants to be found. He's been getting careless lately, leaving traces. The hardware store registry is under his real name now. The implications of that hit Jack hard. After all these years of hiding, why would his father suddenly start leaving breadcrumbs? Unless... Text me the P.O. box details, he said finally. I'll need a few days to arrange things here. We should go together, Emma suggested. 2 sets of eyes are better than one. Jack wanted to refuse, to tell her he worked alone. But something stopped him. Maybe the memory of that photo, of his father's genuine smile, or maybe just the raw honesty in Emma's voice when she talked about him. Fine, he agreed reluctantly. But we do this my way. No cops, no outside help. Agreed. The relief in Emma's voice was palpable. I'll send you everything I have. When do you want to start? The highway stretched endlessly before them, a ribbon of asphalt cutting through the Vermont countryside. Jack gripped his motorcycle's handlebars tighter, glancing in his mirror at Emma's blue sedan following behind. They'd been riding for hours, the autumn trees a blur of red and gold against the gray sky. He hadn't wanted to travel together, but Emma had insisted. We need to share information, she'd said. Now, every time they stopped for gas or coffee, she tried to make conversation. Jack kept his responses short, checking his phone for messages from his club brothers. He'd told them he needed time for personal business. They hadn't liked it, but they'd backed off. For now. At a rest stop just outside of Miller's Creek, Emma approached him with a map spread across the hood of her car. Her finger traced the route they'd taken. The hardware store should be just off Main Street, she said, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. Dad's P.O. box is at the post office 3 blocks away. Jack nodded, studying her profile. In the fading daylight, he could see hints of their father in her features, the same determined set of her jaw, the same careful way she considered problems. It made his chest tight with emotions he didn't want to name. We should find a place to stay first, Emma continued. I spotted a motel sign a few miles back. Fine. Jack turned away, unable to handle the hopeful look in her eyes. But we start early tomorrow. I don't want to waste time. The Pine Grove Motel sat at the edge of town, its weathered sign casting a pale green glow across the nearly empty parking lot. The elderly woman at the front desk barely looked up from her crossword puzzle as she handed them their keys. Rooms 12 and 14, she mumbled. Coffee maker's broken in 12, but the TV works. Their footsteps echoed on the metal walkway as they headed to their rooms. The town spread out below them, streetlights flickering to life in the growing darkness. It looked peaceful, ordinary, the kind of place where people lived simple lives, the kind of place their father had chosen over his own son. Emma paused at her door. Jack? Her voice was soft, hesitant. Thank you for coming. I know this isn't easy. He shrugged, key dangling in his hand. Don't thank me yet. We don't even know if he's still here. But we're trying. That's what matters. Inside his room, Jack paced the worn carpet, too restless to sleep. The ceiling fan spun lazy circles, casting shifting shadows on the walls, He'd removed his leather vest, but kept his boots on, ready to move if needed. Old habits died hard. Through the thin walls, he could hear Emma moving around in the next room, the quiet murmur of her voice as she spoke on the phone. Was she updating someone about their progress? Did she have a whole life full of people who cared where she was, what she was doing? Jack sat on the edge of the bed, head in his hands. The weight of the past 24 hours pressed down on him like a physical thing. Somewhere in this quiet town, his father might be living a normal life, going to work, paying bills, being the kind of man Jack had always wanted him to be. And Emma? She was proof that his father had found happiness after leaving, had built a new family while Jack's world fell apart. The night stretched on, and sleep remained elusive. Tomorrow they would start searching, and Jack wasn't sure if he was ready for what they might find. The diner's neon sign flickered in the early morning light, casting a warm glow through the window where Jack and Emma sat. The smell of coffee and bacon filled the air, mixing with the gentle clatter of plates and murmured conversations from other customers. Jack stirred his coffee absently, watching the cream swirl into patterns. He'd barely touched his eggs, while Emma worked steadily through her stack of pancakes. The silence between them felt heavy, like a wall neither knew how to break down. "He used to make pancakes every Sunday," Emma said suddenly, cutting another small piece. "Always added vanilla to the batter, said it was his mother's secret recipe." Jack's hand tightened around his coffee cup. "Yeah, didn't know he could cook." "He learned after—" Emma hesitated, setting down her fork. "After he left. Said he wanted to do better this time around." The words stung, but Jack forced himself to stay quiet, taking another sip of his cooling coffee. "He kept a photo of you," Emma continued, her voice gentle. "In his wallet. I found it once when I was 12. You were maybe 5 or 6, sitting on his motorcycle." Jack looked up sharply. "What?" Emma nodded, pushing her plate aside. "You were wearing this tiny leather jacket. He told me you'd begged for it for weeks." She smiled softly. "He said you wouldn't take it off, even in summer." The memory hit Jack like a physical blow. He remembered that jacket, how proud he'd felt wearing it, how his father had laughed when he'd insisted on sleeping in it. "He used to tell me stories about you," Emma said. "How brave you were, how smart. The time you fixed his bike's radio when you were 8, even though he hadn't shown you how." "He talked about me?" Jack's voice came out rougher than he intended. "All the time." Emma reached into her purse and pulled out a worn envelope. "I brought something. I thought maybe you'd want to see." She slid several photographs across the table. Jack picked them up with trembling hands. The first showed their father, older but unmistakable, painting what looked like a small kitchen. The second caught him mid-laugh, arms around Emma at what appeared to be her high school graduation. "He wasn't perfect," Emma said quietly. "He drank too much sometimes, especially on your birthday. He'd sit in his garage for hours, just staring at that old photo of you. Some nights I'd hear him crying." Jack swallowed hard, unable to look away from the images. His father's face showed lines he didn't remember. Gray hair at his temples, but his eyes were the same. "The last one's from 2 months ago," Emma said, pointing to the final photo. Their father stood outside a hardware store, loading lumber into a truck. He looked ordinary, like any other man going about his day. Not like someone carrying the weight of an abandoned son. "He taught me to change a tire when I was 14, Emma said, smiling at the memory. "Told me it was something his son already knew how to do. Said you were always good with your hands." Jack blinked rapidly, setting the photos down. "I didn't think—" He cleared his throat. "I didn't think he remembered any of that." Emma reached across the table, hesitating before gently touching his hand. He remembered everything, Jack. He never stopped being your father, even when he couldn't be with you. For the first time since meeting Emma, Jack didn't pull away. They sat in silence, the morning sun warming the table between them, as something shifted in the space between stranger and family. The Bell and Whistle diner sat at the corner of Main and Oak, its weathered sign creaking gently in the morning breeze. Jack and Emma walked through the glass door, a small bell announcing their arrival. The place looked frozen in time, red vinyl booths, chrome trim, and a counter lined with swivel stools. "He worked here?" Jack asked, taking in the worn but clean interior. Emma nodded, leading them to the counter. "For about 6 months when he first came to town. Said it helped him get to know people." An older waitress approached, her gray hair tucked under a paper cap. Her name tag read, Betty. "What can I get you to?" "Actually," Emma said, pulling out a photo, "we were hoping you might remember someone who used to work here. John Martin?" Betty adjusted her glasses, studying the picture. "John, oh yes, quiet fellow. Must have been, 5, 6 years ago now?" She tapped her pen against her order pad. "Kept to himself mostly, but he was good with the customers. Always showed up early to help prep." Jack leaned forward. "What else do you remember about him?" "Well," Betty said, refilling coffee cups further down the counter. "He worked the morning shift, never complained. Fixed our old coffee maker when it broke down." She smiled at the memory. "Wouldn't take any money for it either. Said he liked having something to do with his hands." The image of his father, the man who'd once led a motorcycle gang, serving coffee and fixing appliances, struck Jack like a physical blow. Did he ever... Jack cleared his throat. Did he ever talk about his past? Betty shook her head. Not really. Sometimes he'd get this far-away look, especially when families came in. But he was always kind to the kids, kept candy in his apron pockets for them. Emma caught Jack's eye, and he saw his own surprise reflected there. Their father, the man who'd lived in violence for so long, handing out candy to children. "He left to work at Henderson's Hardware," Betty continued. "Still see him around town sometimes. Always tips his hat, asks how the coffee maker's running." She chuckled. Such a gentleman. Jack stood abruptly, needing air. Emma thanked Betty and followed him outside. They walked in silence for a block before Jack stopped, leaning against a brick wall. "A coffee shop," he said, his voice rough. "He left everything behind to pour coffee and fix things." Emma touched his arm gently. "He left it all behind to start over. To be someone different." "But why?" Jack pushed off the wall, pacing. "He could have taken us with him. Could have..." He trailed off, the reality of their father's new life sinking in. "Look around," Emma said softly, gesturing to the quiet street. Small shops lined the sidewalk, their windows displaying everyday items: books, bread, flowers. People walked unhurried, greeting each other by name. "No violence here, no fear." Jack watched an elderly couple cross the street, the man holding his wife's elbow carefully. A kid rode past on a bicycle, the bell ringing cheerfully. "He chose peace," Jack said, understanding dawning. "He chose..." "A different life," Emma finished. "For all of us." They stood there, watching the town wake up around them. Jack thought about his father serving coffee, fixing things, living quietly in this small corner of the world. So far from the man he'd known, yet somehow exactly who he'd always hoped his father could be. The morning sun warmed the sidewalk as Jack and Emma absorbed the simple truth of their father's transformation. He hadn't just disappeared. He'd rebuilt himself, piece by piece, in this quiet town where violence was nothing more than a distant memory. Scene 1. The late afternoon sun filtered through pine branches as Jack's motorcycle rumbled down the narrow dirt road. Emma sat behind him, directing with gentle taps on his shoulder. Left. Right. The woods grew thicker, their shadows deeper. There, Emma said, pointing to a weathered mailbox with faded numbers. Jack slowed the bike, turning onto a gravel driveway that wound through the trees. His heart hammered against his ribs. After 20 minutes of twisting path, a clearing opened before them. The cabin stood nestled among tall pines, its wood siding weathered to a soft gray. Smoke curled from a stone chimney. A small vegetable garden hugged one side, and split firewood was stacked neatly against the wall. It looked nothing like the places Jack remembered from his childhood. No peeling paint, no broken windows, no empty bottles littering the yard. He killed the engine, and silence settled around them. Emma dismounted first, but Jack remained on the bike, his hands gripping the handlebars. "You okay?" Emma asked softly. Jack stared at the cabin. A rocking chair swayed gently on the covered porch, and wind chimes tinkled in the breeze. So peaceful, so normal. His throat tightened. "I don't know," he managed. Years of practiced toughness crumbled at the sight of this simple home. All this time, he's been here. Just living. Emma waited patiently as Jack swung his leg off the bike. His boots crunched on gravel, each step feeling heavier than the last. The leather of his jacket creaked as he moved, a sound that usually gave him confidence. Now it felt out of place, too harsh for this quiet setting. They walked together up the wooden steps. Jack noticed small details that squeezed his chest. A pair of worn work boots by the door, a coffee mug on the porch rail, a dog's water bowl. Signs of a life lived simply, carefully. "He always wanted this," Jack said, his voice barely above a whisper. "A place away from everything. I remember him talking about it, but I thought—" He trailed off, overcome by memories of late-night conversations with his father. Dreams spoken in the dark that he'd assumed were just that. Dreams. Emma touched his arm. "We don't have to do this right now." Jack shook his head. "Yes, we do." He took a deep breath, fighting the urge to turn back. Anger still simmered beneath his skin. Anger at being left behind, at having to grow up too fast, at finding his father in this peaceful place while his own life had been anything but. Yet alongside that anger was something else, something that felt dangerously like hope. Emma stepped forward and knocked on the wooden door. The sound echoed in Jack's ears like thunder. Footsteps approached from inside. Jack's muscles tensed, years of survival instincts screaming at him to run. The door handle turned. The man who opened the door was both familiar and strange. Gray streaked his once dark hair, and lines creased the corners of his eyes. He wore a flannel shirt and jeans, work-worn and comfortable. But his eyes, those were exactly as Jack remembered them. Deep brown, careful, carrying a weight that never seemed to leave. Their father, now John Martin, stood in the doorway. His eyes moved from Emma to Jack, widening with recognition. The color drained from his face. Jack couldn't move, couldn't speak. Every rehearsed word, every practiced confrontation vanished. He was 8 years old again, looking up at his father, wanting answers to questions he didn't know how to ask. The silence stretched between them like a physical thing, heavy and thick. John Martin, their father, stepped back, wordlessly inviting them inside. The cabin's interior matched its exterior. Simple, orderly, with hand-carved furniture and well-worn rugs covering the wooden floors. "Sit, please," he said, his voice rougher than Jack remembered. Jack remained standing, his fists clenched at his sides. Emma sank into an armchair, her eyes never leaving their father's face. "Why?" The word burst from Jack like a gunshot. 20 years of nothing, not a word, not a sign you were alive. Their father moved to the stone fireplace, bracing one hand against the rough mantel. I had no choice. There's always a choice, Jack snapped. You chose to leave us, to leave me. Jack, Emma started, but their father held up his hand. No, he's right. John turned to face them both. I did choose, and every day since then I've lived with that choice. The fire crackled in the silence that followed. Outside, wind rustled through the pines. The Reynolds gang, John finally said, his voice low. They were coming for Emma. They'd already killed her mother, my second wife. He looked at Emma, whose face had gone pale. They would have killed you too, just to hurt me. Jack shook his head. What are you talking about? I crossed them years ago, stopped one of their drug shipments, cost them millions. John's shoulders slumped. They swore they'd take everything from me. When they found out about Emma, so you ran. Jack's voice cracked. Left us both behind? I took Emma and disappeared, changed our names, moved constantly. John's eyes met Jack's. But you were safer without me. You had your mother's family, connections in the club. The Reynolds wouldn't touch you there. Emma stood suddenly, her hands trembling. But why didn't you come back? Tears spilled down her cheeks. After they fell apart, why didn't you come back for me? John reached for her, but she stepped away. By then, the damage was done. I thought... He swallowed hard. I thought you were better off without me. Both of you. Jack watched as Emma crumpled back into the chair, her shoulders shaking. Everything he'd believed about his father, the abandonment, the betrayal, was shifting, reforming into something he didn't know how to process. You could have told me, Jack said quietly. I would have understood. Would you have? John asked. You were 8 years old. Could you have kept that secret? One slip, one wrong word to the wrong person, and they would have found Emma. Jack moved to the window, staring out at the peaceful clearing. He remembered the violence of those years, the bodies that sometimes turned up in alleys. The Reynolds gang had been brutal, efficient, and now extinct, thanks to their own bloody civil war. All these years, Emma whispered, I thought you just didn't want me anymore. John made a sound like he'd been struck. No, Emma, never that. You were everything to me. Both of you were. Jack turned back to the room, seeing his father's pain written plainly across his face. The hardened biker facade had cracked completely, revealing the man beneath, a man who had carried this burden alone for 20 years. I made the only choice I could, John said, but I've regretted the cost every day since. The old grandfather clock in the corner ticked steadily, marking each heavy moment. John Martin pulled out a wooden chair from the small dining table and sat down heavily, his weathered hands clasped together. The Reynolds gang wasn't just any group of thugs, he began, his voice low and strained. They had people everywhere, in the police force, local government, even hospitals. When they marked someone for death, there was nowhere to hide, not in the usual ways. Jack leaned against the wall, arms crossed. So you just disappeared completely? I had to. John reached into his pocket and pulled out an old, creased photo. He handed it to Emma. This was taken the night before we left. Emma's hands trembled as she looked at the photograph. I remember this dress, she whispered. Mom bought it for my 6th birthday. Jack moved closer, peering over Emma's shoulder. The photo showed a younger Emma, beaming at the camera in a pink party dress. Behind her stood their father, looking nothing like the man who sat before them now. His hair had been dark then, his face unmarked by the years of worry that now creased it. The next morning I got a package, John's voice grew hoarse. Inside was a bullet and a note with Emma's school address. They wanted me to know they could reach her any time. Emma's breath caught. Jack watched as she gripped the photo tighter, her knuckles turning white. I had contacts, John continued, people who could help us disappear completely, new identities, new lives, but it had to be absolute, no connections to the past, no goodbyes. But why didn't you take me too? Jack's question came out sharper than he intended. John looked at his son, pain etched in every line of his face. Because you were protected, Jack. Your mother's family, the club, they were powerful enough to keep the Reynolds away. But Emma, he turned to his daughter. You had no one else, just me. So you chose her, Jack said flatly. No, John's voice cracked. I chose to keep you both alive, in the only way I could. Taking you would have started a war between the clubs. Leaving you where you were safe was the hardest decision I've ever made. The truth of it hit Jack like a physical blow. All these years, he'd believed his father's disappearance was about him, about not being enough, about being unwanted. But it had never been about that at all. I watched you when I could, John admitted quietly. From a distance. I saw you graduate high school, Jack. Saw you join the club. Every time I wanted to reach out to explain. But the Reynolds were still out there, still hunting. One wrong move would have put both of you in danger. Emma wiped tears from her face. But they're gone now. Have been for years. By then, the damage was done. I'd become a ghost. John's shoulders sagged under the weight of his confession. I convinced myself you were better off without me disrupting your lives again. Jack stared at his father, seeing him truly for the first time. Not as the man who abandoned him, but as someone who had carried an impossible choice for 20 years. The anger that had fueled him for so long began to shift, making room for something else. Understanding. The silence that followed was different from before. Less hostile, more contemplative. Jack found himself looking between his father and Emma, seeing the pieces of their broken family in a new light. The truth hadn't erased the past, but it had changed its meaning entirely. The evening shadows stretched across the cabin's worn floorboards when Emma's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, and her face went pale. What is it? Jack asked, straightening from his position against the wall. Emma's hands shook as she held up her phone. It's a text from an unknown number. She swallowed hard. There's a picture of me, from yesterday, at the diner where we stopped. John Martin moved faster than his age suggested, crossing the room to look at the message. His weathered face hardened. The Reynolds. That's impossible, Jack said, but even as the words left his mouth, he knew better. Gang grudges didn't die easily. They never stopped watching, John said quietly. They just waited until they could hurt me the most. He ran a hand through his gray hair. And now they know about both of you. Emma's phone buzzed again. This time she dropped it like it was burning hot. Jack picked it up, his jaw clenching as he read the message aloud. The debt comes due. Your daughter pays the price. I need to leave, Emma said, standing up so quickly her chair scraped against the floor. If I go now, maybe… No, Jack and John said simultaneously. You can't run, Jack continued, his voice firm. Trust me, I know these types. They'll just keep coming. Emma hugged herself, looking smaller than she had all day. Then what are we supposed to do? They found me once. They'll find me again. Jack paced the small living room, his mind racing. He knew what needed to be done, but the choice wasn't easy. Staying meant facing his old life, the violence he'd been trying to leave behind. It meant putting himself directly in the crosshairs of people who made killing their business. But looking at Emma, seeing the fear in her eyes, He knew he couldn't walk away. Not this time. "I'll stay," Jack said, his voice steady. "I'll protect you." "Jack, no," Emma protested. "You don't understand what they're capable of." "Actually, I do." Jack's hand unconsciously touched the scar on his forearm, a reminder of his own violent past. "But I'm not the same person I was, and I'm not letting them hurt my sister." The word sister hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. It was the first time Jack had acknowledged their relationship so directly. John stepped forward. "Son, you don't have to—" "Yes, I do." Jack's voice was firm. "You protected her by running. I'm protecting her by staying." Emma crossed the room to stand in front of Jack, her eyes searching his face. "Why? After everything, why would you risk your life for me?" Jack looked at her, then at their father, seeing the same worry lines creasing both their faces. For years, he'd been angry at being left behind, but now he understood something about family, real family, that he'd never known before. "Because that's what brothers do," he said simply, "and I'm done running from who I am or who I could be." The silence that followed was broken only by the steady ticking of the grandfather clock. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, and somewhere in the distance, a car door slammed. They all knew the danger was real, but in that moment, something else was more important. The bond of family, newly formed but already unbreakable. Emma reached out and squeezed Jack's hand, a gesture of trust and gratitude that said more than words could. Their father watched them, his eyes glistening with both pride and fear for what was to come. The afternoon sun filtered through the cabin's dusty windows as Jack pulled out his old duffel bag from the trunk of his motorcycle. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, checking the contents he hadn't touched in months. "You kept all this?" Emma asked, watching from the doorway. Jack nodded without looking up. "Never could bring myself to get rid of it." He laid out items on the wooden table, a bulletproof vest, backup phones, and various other tools from his previous life. Their father stood in the corner, his face a mask of concern. "Jack, there might be another way." "There isn't," Jack cut him off, his voice firm but not unkind. "The Reynolds don't negotiate. They never have." Emma picked up one of the burner phones, turning it over in her hands. "I never wanted this. I never wanted to put you in danger." Jack paused in his preparations, looking at his sister. The worry in her eyes reminded him of someone else, someone he used to be, before the gang became his family. "You didn't put me in danger, Emma. I chose this." Their father moved to the table, his weathered hands hovering over the equipment. "I recognize some of these," he said quietly. "Things haven't changed much." "Some things have," Jack replied, pulling out a small notebook filled with contact numbers. "I know people who can help, people who owe me favors." Emma watched as Jack made calls, his voice taking on a harder edge she hadn't heard before. It was like watching someone put on an old coat, familiar but not quite fitting the same way anymore. "We'll need to secure the perimeter," Jack explained, sketching a rough map of the area. "Dad, you remember how to set up surveillance points?" John nodded, years of experience evident in his eyes. "Some things you never forget." As they worked through the afternoon, Jack felt the familiar rush of adrenaline, the heightened awareness that came with preparing for conflict. But this time was different. He wasn't fighting for territory or respect. He was fighting for family. Emma helped where she could, learning quickly despite her obvious discomfort with the situation. She handled the equipment with careful determination, asking questions that showed both her intelligence and her fear. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the trees, Jack stepped outside for a moment alone. The cool evening air filled his lungs as he leaned against the cabin wall, his father's old leather jacket heavy on his shoulders. Inside, he could hear Emma and their father talking in low voices, working together to secure the windows. The sound of their cooperation, their trust in each other, made something twist in his chest. Looking down at his hands, Jack could almost see the ghost of who he used to be, the angry young man who thought violence was the only answer. Now those same hands were being used to protect, to build something worth fighting for. The man he had been wouldn't have understood this feeling, this fierce need to keep his family safe, this desire to be better than his past. That man had known only revenge and survival. But as Jack watched the last rays of sunlight disappear behind the trees, he realized he was standing at a crossroads. Behind him lay years of violence and anger. Ahead, the uncertain path of redemption through protection of his newfound family. The weight of his choices pressed down on him like the gathering darkness. He was still capable of the violence his old life had required, but now it felt different, a tool rather than a way of life. The question that haunted him wasn't whether he could protect them, but whether protecting them would pull him back into the darkness he'd been trying to escape. Dawn broke over the cabin, painting the kitchen in soft, golden light. Jack sat at the worn wooden table, cradling a cup of coffee between his hands. His father, John now, he reminded himself, settled into the chair across from him, the old floorboards creaking beneath his weight. "Couldn't sleep either?" John asked, his voice rough with exhaustion. Jack shook his head, staring into his coffee. "Been thinking about that old Harley you used to have. Remember how you'd take me for rides on weekends?" A small smile crossed John's weathered face. "That beat-up '85 Softail? You used to beg me to go faster?" "Mom hated that bike," Jack said, the memory warming him despite everything. "Said it was going to get us both killed. She wasn't wrong to worry." John's fingers traced the rim of his mug. "I wasn't always the best at making safe choices back then." Silence settled between them, heavy with unspoken words. Through the window, birds began their morning songs, oblivious to the tension building in the small cabin. "I used to think you left because of me," Jack finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Thought maybe I wasn't enough reason to stay." John's hand trembled as he set down his coffee. "Jack, leaving you was the hardest thing I've ever done. Not a day went by that I didn't think about you. Wonder if you were safe." "But you had Emma to protect." "I had 2 children to protect," John corrected him firmly. "The Reynolds would have used you to get to her. I couldn't risk either of you." Jack absorbed this, watching the steam rise from his cup. "Tell me about her, about Emma's mom." John's eyes softened with old memories. "Sarah she was like sunshine. Strong, brave. Emma has her smile, you know, and her determination." A floorboard creaked behind them, and they turned to see Emma standing in the doorway, her hair messy from sleep. Before anyone could speak, a sharp crack echoed through the trees outside. Jack was on his feet instantly, moving to the window with practiced stealth. Through the early morning mist, he caught movement at the tree line, dark figures moving with purpose. "They're here," he said quietly, his body tensing for action. "Earlier than I expected?" Emma's face paled, but she moved quickly to her designated position, grabbing the backup phone they'd prepared. John was already checking the rear windows, his movements showing traces of his old life. 3 vehicles at the north end," Jack reported, scanning the perimeter. "They're trying to surround us." Emma's hands were steady as she started making calls to Jack's contacts. John retrieved the weapons they'd hidden around the cabin, his face set with grim determination. Jack looked at his family, his sister's quiet strength, his father's resolute stance, and felt something shift inside him. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about protecting what he'd just found, what he'd thought he'd lost forever. "Remember the plan," he said, checking his gear one last time. "We stay together. We watch each other's backs." Another shot rang out, closer this time. Glass shattered somewhere in the back of the cabin. Emma flinched but kept her position, her jaw set with determination. John moved to cover the broken window, his movements sure despite the years away from violence. The morning sun now streamed fully through the windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. Outside, engines rumbled as vehicles moved into position. The Reynolds were done waiting. The final confrontation was about to begin. The first bullets tore through the cabin's walls like angry wasps. Jack grabbed Emma and pulled her behind the solid oak kitchen counter as splinters flew everywhere. Their father dove behind an overturned table, his movements still quick despite his age. "Stay down!" Jack shouted over the chaos. The familiar smell of gunpowder filled his nostrils, bringing back memories he'd tried to forget. Through the broken window, he could see shadows moving, at least 8 men advancing on the cabin. The Reynolds gang hadn't come to talk. They'd come to finish what they'd started years ago. "Back door," Jack commanded, touching Emma's shoulder. She nodded, her face pale but determined. They crawled across the floor while their father provided cover fire from his position. The sound of breaking glass came from multiple windows now. Jack's heart hammered in his chest as he recognized the pattern. They were being surrounded. This was how the Reynolds operated. He'd seen it before, back in his darkest days. "They're trying to box us in," John called out, his voice steady despite the danger. "We need to move now." Jack peeked around the corner and caught sight of a familiar face. Mickey Reynolds, the gang's enforcer. Their eyes met for a split second, and Jack saw the savage grin spread across Mickey's face. This was personal for him. "Jack," Emma's voice cut through his thoughts. She was at the back door, their father covering her position. Mickey's voice boomed from outside. "Come on out, Jackie boy. Let's finish this like old times." The taunt hit Jack like a physical blow. His fingers tightened on his weapon, rage burning through his veins. The old Jack would have charged out there, would have met violence with violence. But Emma's presence behind him changed everything. Her hand touched his arm, and he felt the trembling she was trying to hide. His sister needed him. Not the man he used to be, but the brother he could become. "We're getting out of here," Jack said firmly, pushing down his anger. "Together." They made their break for it as the gang breached the front door. Jack laid down suppressing fire while Emma and their father ran for the tree line. Mickey's angry shout followed them into the woods. The dense forest provided cover, but Jack knew it wouldn't last long. He could hear the gang's heavy footsteps behind them, closing in. They reached a small clearing, and suddenly Mickey burst through the undergrowth, his massive frame blocking their path. "Nowhere to run now," Mickey snarled, raising his weapon. Time seemed to slow. Jack saw the old path before him, the fight, the blood, the satisfaction of violence. But he also saw Emma's frightened face, saw his father moving to shield her. In that moment, he made his choice. Instead of attacking, Jack grabbed a nearby branch and swung it hard, not at Mickey but at the ground between them. The motion kicked up a cloud of leaves and dirt, momentarily blinding their pursuer. Jack used the distraction to push his family toward a hidden ravine he'd spotted earlier. "Down here," he hissed, helping Emma navigate the steep slope. Their father followed, and Jack brought up the rear, covering their tracks as best he could. They heard Mickey's frustrated roar above them, followed by confused shouts as the gang lost their trail in the thick underbrush. Jack led his family through the ravine, away from the violence, away from his past. For now, they had escaped. Jack knew the Reynolds wouldn't give up easily, but he'd chosen a different path. He'd chosen family over violence, protection over revenge. As they moved silently through the forest, Jack realized he felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Hope. The abandoned ranger station stood hidden among towering pines, its weathered walls offering shelter from both the elements and pursuing eyes. Jack secured the perimeter while Emma helped their father tend to a small cut on his arm from their escape through the woods. Inside, dust covered everything. Cobwebs stretched across corners, and old maps hung crooked on the walls. But it was safe. For now, Jack watched through a grimy window as the sun began to set, painting the forest in deep shadows. "You could have killed him back there," his father said quietly, breaking the silence. "Mickey, I saw the opening you had." Jack's shoulders tensed. He kept his eyes on the darkening forest. "Yeah, I could have. But you didn't." Emma's voice was soft, understanding. Jack turned from the window, looking at his sister and father. In the dim light, they seemed more real than ever, not just strangers thrust into his life, but family. His hands, which had dealt so much violence over the years, felt heavy at his sides. "All my life," Jack said, leaning against the wall, "I thought being strong meant being the one who hit hardest, the one who scared people the most." He let out a long breath. "The gang taught me that fear equals respect." Emma moved closer, her presence gentle but steady. "And now?" "Now?" Jack looked down at his hands. "Now I'm thinking maybe real strength isn't about hurting people at all." Their father stood up, wincing slightly. "It took me years to learn that lesson. Too many years." His eyes met Jack's. "I'm sorry I wasn't there to teach you differently." The old anger flickered in Jack's chest, but it felt distant now, like a dying ember. "When you left?" He paused, organizing his thoughts. "I filled that hole with rage. Thought if I became everything you were running from, it would somehow hurt you back." "Oh, Jack," Emma whispered, her eyes glistening. "But today, watching you two—" Jack's voice grew rough with emotion. "All I wanted was to get you to safety, not to fight, not to prove anything, just to protect." The room fell quiet except for the whisper of wind through the trees outside. Jack moved away from the window and sat heavily in an old wooden chair. "I've done things I'm not proud of," he continued, "things that'll probably haunt me forever. But today, when I chose not to fight Mickey, when I found another way—" He looked up at his sister and father. "For the first time in years, I felt like maybe I'm not just my mistakes." Emma reached out and took his hand. Her touch was warm, accepting. "You're not your past, Jack. You're what you choose to be now." Their father placed a hand on Jack's shoulder, the gesture tentative but sincere. "We've all made mistakes, son. The hardest part isn't living with them. It's learning to forgive ourselves." Jack felt something crack inside him, like ice breaking in spring. The walls he'd built around his heart began to crumble. He squeezed Emma's hand and reached up to grasp his father's. "I don't want to be that person anymore," he said, his voice stronger now. "I want to be someone who builds things up instead of tearing them down, someone who protects instead of destroys." The warmth of his family's touch anchored him, and Jack felt tears he'd held back for years finally start to fall. Here, in this dusty ranger station, surrounded by the people he'd once thought lost to him forever, Jack began to see a different path forward, one that didn't require violence to prove his worth. The morning sun filtered through the ranger station's dusty windows, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. Jack sat at the old desk, a worn notebook open before him. His pen moved across the paper with purpose as he listed out what needed to be done. Emma approached with 2 steaming cups of instant coffee, setting one beside him. "Making plans?" she asked, peering over his shoulder. Jack nodded, taking a grateful sip. Can't keep running forever. Need to figure out our next steps. He tapped the pen against the paper. First thing, I'm done with the Angels. Completely done. Their father looked up from where he was checking the bandage on his arm. They won't let you go easily, son. I know. Jack's jaw set firmly. But I've got contacts. Guys who got out clean. They'll help me do this right. He turned to Emma. What about you? Your life back home? Emma wrapped her hands around her coffee cup, considering. My job's remote anyway. I can work from anywhere. She smiled softly. Besides, I just found my family. I'm not letting go now. Jack felt a warmth spread through his chest at her words. He looked down at his list again. We'll need a place to stay. Somewhere quiet, but not too isolated. He drew a circle around that point. Maybe that little town we passed through. Miller's Creek seemed peaceful. I know someone there, their father offered. Owns a construction company, always looking for good workers. Jack's eyebrows rose. Construction? He'd never considered it before, but the idea of building things instead of destroying them held a certain appeal. Yeah, I could do that. Emma touched his arm gently. You'd be good at it. You've always been good with your hands. They spent the next hour planning, their father offering suggestions about safe houses and trusted contacts. Jack felt something shifting inside him, hope replacing the constant anger he'd carried for so long. Later, as the afternoon sun began to fade, Jack and Emma sat on the station's small porch. The forest stretched before them, peaceful and vast. A gentle breeze carried the scent of pine needles and wild roses. You know, Emma said softly, when I first found out about you, I was terrified you'd want nothing to do with me. Jack turned to look at her profile, seeing hints of their father in her features. I almost didn't. She nodded, understanding. But you gave me a chance, gave us a chance. Best decision I ever made, Jack admitted. He watched a pair of birds swooping between the trees. Never thought I'd have this. Family, future, hope. His voice grew quiet. Never thought I deserved it. Emma leaned against his shoulder, her presence steady and reassuring. Everyone deserves a second chance, Jack. Even Hell's Angels. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun paint the sky in shades of gold and pink. The peace between them felt earned, built on shared struggles and newfound understanding. Jack realized that for the first time in years, he wasn't carrying the weight of his anger alone. The forest around them grew quiet as evening approached, but the silence wasn't lonely anymore. It was filled with possibility, of new beginnings, of healing, of family. Jack and Emma remained on the porch, shoulder to shoulder, ready to face whatever came next together. The evening settled over the ranger station as Jack and Emma sat at the small kitchen table, sharing a simple meal of canned soup and crackers. The familiar comfort of sitting together had become a welcome part of their daily routine. Emma stirred her soup thoughtfully. I've been thinking about Miller's Creek, she said. There's this little bookkeeping business I spotted when we drove through. They might need help. Her eyes brightened. I could set up my remote work there, maybe even expand into local clients. Jack nodded, watching his sister's enthusiasm grow. It still amazed him how naturally the word sister had settled into his thoughts. You always did have a head for numbers, he said, remembering the way she'd calculated their travel routes with precise efficiency. And you? Emma asked, breaking a cracker in half. Besides construction, what else could you see yourself doing? Jack leaned back in his chair, considering. Never really thought beyond the next ride, the next job. He rubbed his chin thoughtfully. But I'm good with machines, maybe mechanics. Every town needs someone who can fix bikes. Legitimate bikes, Emma added with a small smile. Yeah, Jack chuckled. Legitimate bikes. The word felt good on his tongue. Legitimate. Normal. Safe. Emma reached across the table and touched his hand. We could find a place with enough room for both of us. Maybe a house with a garage for your work? The idea of sharing a home, of having a permanent address, should have terrified him. Instead, Jack felt a surge of anticipation. Would you want that? Living with your ex-gang member brother? No, Emma said firmly. Living with my brother who's brave enough to change his life. Her eyes met his, full of conviction. We've lost too many years already, Jack. I don't want to lose any more. Jack squeezed her hand, throat tight with emotion. Neither do I. Their father's heavy footsteps on the porch interrupted the moment. He entered the kitchen, his face drawn with worry lines. Jack stood up, knowing it was time for the conversation he'd been avoiding. Dad, he said, the word still feeling new on his tongue. Can we talk? Their father nodded, settling into a chair at the table. Jack remained standing, needing the space to find his words. I'm done with the past, Jack began. The angels, the violence, all of it. I want something different now. He glanced at Emma, drawing strength from her encouraging nod. And I want you to be part of it. Their father's weathered hands clenched on the table. Jack, son, after everything I did, everything I didn't do. I know why you left, Jack said. I understand now. But that's the past. We're talking about the future. The future? Their father's voice cracked. I don't know if I deserve one with you both. The choices I made. We've all made choices, Jack insisted. But we're here now. Together. He looked between Emma and their father, feeling the weight of the moment. I'm ready to leave it all behind. Start fresh. But I want us to do it as a family. Their father's eyes glistened with unshed tears, his hands trembling slightly on the table. The silence stretched between them, heavy with years of pain and regret, but also with the possibility of healing. Their father's shoulders slumped as he stared at his weathered hands. The kitchen's dim light cast shadows across his face, highlighting the deep lines etched by years of worry and regret. I've spent so many nights, he began, his voice barely above a whisper, lying awake, thinking about both of you, wondering if I made the right choice. He lifted his gaze to Emma, then to Jack. Every birthday, every Christmas, every time I heard a motorcycle on the street, it all reminded me of what I'd left behind. Jack pulled out a chair and sat down, leaning forward. The old wooden chair creaked under his weight. But you did it to protect us. Did I? Their father's voice cracked. Or did I just make everything worse? I left you alone, Jack. Left you to fall into the same life I was trying to escape. He rubbed his face with trembling hands. And Emma? I kept you safe. But at what cost? You grew up without a brother, without knowing half of who you are. Emma reached across the table, placing her hand over their father's. But we found each other. We're here now. That's what scares me the most, their father admitted. Being here, being part of your lives again. What if I mess it up? What if I'm not the father you both need? His eyes grew distant. I don't even know how to be a father anymore. I've been running for so long, living as John Martin, trying to forget who I really am. Jack felt a familiar surge of anger, but this time it was different. It wasn't directed at his father, but at the circumstances that had torn their family apart. You know who you are, he said firmly. You're the man who gave up everything to keep his daughter safe, the man who's carried that weight all these years. But I failed you, Jack. Their father's voice was heavy with regret. I left you to face it all alone. Yeah, you did, Jack acknowledged, his tone softening. "And for a long time I hated you for it. But now I understand you did what you thought was right. Maybe it wasn't perfect, but you tried." Emma squeezed their father's hand. "We're not asking you to be perfect. We're just asking you to be here." Their father looked between them, his eyes glistening. "I don't know how to start over, how to be a family again." "Neither do we," Jack said, allowing a small smile to cross his face. "But we're figuring it out together. That's what family does." "Family," their father repeated the word as if testing its weight. "After everything that's happened, you still want me to be part of your family?" Jack reached out, placing his hand over Emma's and their father's. "We're not the same people we were back then. I'm not that angry kid anymore, and you're not running anymore. We've all changed." He paused, meeting his father's gaze. "But one thing hasn't changed. We're still family. Nothing can take that away from us." A tear rolled down their father's cheek as he nodded slowly, his hands steadying under his children's touch. The kitchen fell quiet, but it wasn't the tense silence of before. Instead, it was filled with understanding, with acceptance, with the tentative peace of a family finding its way back together. Emma smiled softly. "Welcome home, Dad." Their father's shoulders relaxed, and for the first time since they'd found him, he looked truly present in the moment, no longer haunted by the shadows of his past choices. He squeezed both their hands, accepting the gift of forgiveness they offered, allowing himself to believe in the possibility of a future together. Scene 1. The morning sun filtered through the car windows as Jack and Emma drove through another small town. Real estate listings were scattered across Emma's lap, and she held her phone, checking addresses against their map. "What about this one?" Emma pointed to a listing with a small blue house. "It's within our budget, and it's far enough from any major cities." Jack glanced at the photo while keeping one hand on the steering wheel. "Looks peaceful. No gang territory for at least 100 miles in any direction." He drummed his fingers on the wheel, a habit he'd picked up during their house-hunting trips. "What's the neighborhood like?" "According to the listing, it's mostly families and retirees." Emma scrolled through her phone. "There's a park nearby, and the crime rate is really low." They pulled into the town of Cedar Grove, population 3,242 according to the welcome sign. The streets were lined with maple trees, their leaves just starting to show hints of fall colors. Small shops dotted the main street, a hardware store, a family-owned grocery, a diner with red vinyl booths visible through large windows. "Different from what we're used to," Jack commented, slowing down to let an elderly couple cross the street. Emma smiled. "That's kind of the point, isn't it?" They turned onto Oak Street, where the house they'd come to see was located. It was a modest one-story home, with white trim and navy shutters. A small front porch held 2 rocking chairs, and the yard, though slightly overgrown, had potential. "This is it," Emma said, double-checking the address. "The realtor should be here soon." They got out of the car, and Jack walked the perimeter of the property, old habits dying hard as he checked the sight lines and possible entry points. But this time, it wasn't about security. It was about making sure the foundation was solid, the roof wasn't sagging, all the normal things a potential homeowner should look for. Emma joined him in the backyard, which featured an old apple tree and enough space for a garden. "What do you think?" "It needs work," Jack said, noting the peeling paint and loose gutters. "But it's solid. Nothing we can't fix ourselves." A car pulled up out front, and their realtor, Sarah Martinez, stepped out with a folder of papers and a ring of keys. "Good morning. Ready to take a look inside?" The interior was simple but welcoming. Hardwood floors ran throughout, though they needed refinishing. The living room had a brick fireplace, and the kitchen, while dated, was spacious enough for family meals. The previous owners were here for 30 years, Sarah explained as they walked through. Raised their kids here. They moved to Florida to be closer to their grandchildren. Jack noticed Emma running her hand along the door frame, where pencil marks tracked the heights of children as they grew. She caught his eye and smiled softly. There's 3 bedrooms, Sarah continued. The master is at one end of the house and the other 2 share a bathroom between them. They walked through each room, noting what would need to be fixed or updated. The walls needed paint, and the carpet in the bedrooms should be replaced, but nothing was beyond their abilities. In the kitchen, Emma leaned against the counter, looking out the window at the backyard. I can see us here, she said quietly. Having Sunday dinners with Dad, maybe planting a garden in the spring. Jack stood beside her, taking in the view. The apple tree swayed gently in the breeze, and a neighbor's wind chimes tinkled in the distance. It was peaceful, a word he'd rarely used in his life before. Yeah, he agreed. I can see it too. Emma turned to Sarah. We'd like to make an offer. Jack sat at the kitchen table of their newly purchased home, staring at his phone. Names and numbers from his past life filled the screen, brothers from the gang who had been through hell with him. His thumb hovered over the first contact. Emma placed a cup of coffee in front of him. You don't have to do this all at once, she said softly. Yeah, I do. Jack picked up the coffee, letting its warmth seep into his hands. Can't move forward if I'm still tied to the past? He pressed the first number. Rico, his oldest friend in the gang, answered on the 3rd ring. Jack? Man, where you been? Hey, Rico. Jack's voice was steady, though his hand gripped the coffee mug tighter. Got a minute to talk? The conversation was harder than any fight he'd been in. Jack explained his situation, finding his sister, reconnecting with his father, choosing a different path. Rico listened in silence. So that's it? You're just walking away? Rico's voice held more hurt than anger. I have to. For my family, but mostly for myself. Jack took a deep breath. I owe you more than a phone call, but this is how it has to be. There was a long pause. You were always different, man. Too good for this life, even if you didn't know it. Rico sighed. Stay safe, brother. One by one, Jack made his calls. Some conversations were harder than others. A few ended in anger, but most of his old brothers understood. They'd all joined the gang looking for family. Now Jack had found his real one. Emma started her new job at the local library that afternoon. Jack drove her there, watching as she walked up the stone steps with a spring in her step. She'd always loved books, she'd told him, and working at the library felt like coming home. Back at their house, Jack started working on the repairs they'd planned. The repetitive motion of sanding the hardwood floors brought an unexpected peace. His hands, once used only for violence, were creating something beautiful. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows as he worked, casting long shadows across the partially refinished floor. The house smelled of sawdust and wood polish. Outside, birds chirped in the apple tree, and somewhere down the street, a lawnmower hummed. When Emma came home, she found Jack sitting on their front porch, watching the sunset. She settled into the rocking chair next to him. How was your first day? He asked. Amazing! Her eyes lit up. The kids' story time is my favorite part. There's this little girl, Sophie, who asked if I could read her favorite book every day this week. Jack smiled, feeling the simple joy in her words. And the rest of the staff? They're wonderful. Sarah, the head librarian, already invited me to join their book club. Emma looked at him carefully. How did your calls go? Better than I expected? Jack rocked slowly, letting the chair's gentle motion soothe him. It's done. That chapter's closed. They sat in comfortable silence as the sky turned pink and orange. A neighbor walked by with their dog, waving hello. The evening air was cool and clean, carrying the scent of someone's dinner cooking nearby. Emma reached over and squeezed his hand. "You okay?" Jack looked at their small house, at the half-finished projects waiting inside, at the quiet street where children would soon be riding their bikes. He thought about the library where his sister would read stories to kids, and the garden they'd plant in spring. "Yeah," he said, and meant it. "I'm okay." The bell above the hardware store door chimed as Jack walked in, his arms full of paint samples for the living room. Emma had insisted on trying different shades, though to him, beige was beige. He nodded at Tom, the store owner, and headed toward the paint section. "Jack?" A familiar voice froze him in his tracks. Standing by the power tools was Marcus, one of the gang's enforcers. His leather vest was gone, replaced by a plain work shirt, but the tattoos creeping up his neck were unmistakable. Jack's muscles tensed. "Marcus, didn't expect to see you here. Got a job with a construction crew." Marcus stepped closer, lowering his voice. "But that's not why I'm here. The boys, they're not happy about how you left." Jack set the paint samples down carefully. His heart hammered in his chest, but his voice remained steady. "That life's behind me." "Is it?" Marcus glanced around the empty aisle. "Look, I get it. You found your family. But Snake, he's taking it personal, says you disrespected the Brotherhood." The mention of Snake, their leader, made Jack's stomach knot. He knew Snake's reputation for holding grudges, for making examples of those who crossed him. "I made my calls, said my goodbyes." Jack stepped back, creating distance. "It's done." "Not to Snake, it isn't." Marcus rubbed his neck, looking uncomfortable. "He sent me to deliver a message. Either you come back and make things right, or—" He left the threat hanging. Jack's mind raced to Emma at the library, to their father finally finding peace in their new life. The quiet happiness they'd built felt suddenly fragile. "I'm giving you a heads up because we rode together," Marcus continued. "But Snake's serious. He'll be here by the weekend." Tom's voice carried from the front of the store, asking if they needed help. Jack shook his head. "Tell Snake I'm not running," Jack said quietly. "But if he comes here looking for trouble, he'll find it." Marcus nodded slowly. "That's what I figured you'd say." He turned to leave, then paused. "For what it's worth, I hope you make it work here. Seems like you found something worth protecting." After Marcus left, Jack stood in the paint aisle, his hands shaking slightly. The peaceful life he'd been building was about to collide with his past. He could pack up, move Emma and their father somewhere else. But that would mean running forever. At home that evening, Jack watched Emma prepare dinner, chatting about her day at the library. She'd started a reading program for local kids, her face glowing with enthusiasm as she described their reactions to the stories. His father sat at the kitchen table, working on a crossword puzzle, occasionally asking for help with a clue. The scene was so normal, so precious in its simplicity. Jack knew what he had to do. He couldn't let Snake destroy this. He wouldn't run, wouldn't hide. This time he would face his past not with violence, but with the strength that came from having something real to protect. Later that night, after Emma and their father had gone to bed, Jack sat on the porch steps. The street was quiet, except for crickets and distant dogs barking. He pulled out his phone and made a call. "Rico, I need your help one last time. Snake's coming and I'm going to end this. The right way." The parking lot of Mike's diner sat empty in the early morning light, save for 2 motorcycles and a beaten-up pickup truck. Jack pulled up in his car, gravel crunching under the tires. Through the window he could see Snake sitting in a booth, 2 of his men flanking him at nearby tables. Jack had chosen this place carefully, public enough to discourage violence, but quiet enough for a real conversation. Rico, His old friend from the gang who'd agreed to mediate waited outside, leaning against his bike. "You sure about this?" Rico asked as Jack approached. "Yeah." Jack straightened his shoulders. "No weapons, just like we agreed?" Rico nodded. "Snake's clean. I checked myself." Inside, the diner smelled of coffee and bacon. The elderly waitress behind the counter barely looked up from her crossword puzzle as Jack walked past. Snake watched him approach, his face unreadable beneath his graying beard. "Sit," Snake said, gesturing to the booth opposite him. Jack slid in, noting how the vinyl seat squeaked, an odd detail to focus on at a moment like this. "Thanks for meeting me. Marcus said you'd gone soft." Snake's voice was gravelly, worn by years of cigarettes and hard living. "Living the family life now, huh?" "That's right." Jack met his gaze steadily. "And that's why we need to settle this." Snake leaned forward, his weathered hands clasped on the table. "You disrespected the Brotherhood, walking away without so much as a word to me. I made my calls, paid my dues. You know that." Jack kept his voice level. "The only reason you're here is pride." A muscle twitched in Snake's jaw. One of his men shifted in his seat, but Snake held up a hand to keep him still. "You were one of my best," Snake said, "like a son to me. And you were like a father when I needed one." Jack softened his tone. "But I found my real father, my sister. I've got a chance at something different." "Different?" Snake scoffed. "You think you can just walk away from who you are?" "I'm not walking away from who I am." Jack leaned forward. "I'm choosing who I want to be. There's a difference." The waitress appeared, with coffee, pouring it without asking. The familiar routine of her movements seemed to diffuse some of the tension. "I respect what you built," Jack continued. "The Brotherhood saved my life when I was young and stupid, but it's not my life anymore, and deep down, you know that's how it should be." Snake stared into his coffee cup, something shifting in his expression. "Your old man, he got out too, didn't he? Built something new?" "Yeah, he did." A long moment passed, filled only by the quiet clinking of dishes from the kitchen and the hum of the diner's ancient air conditioning. Finally, Snake looked up. "You know, 20 years ago, I had a chance to get out, had a woman, talked about kids." He shook his head. "Sometimes I wonder." Jack waited, sensing the weight of the moment. "Go live your life, kid." Snake stood up, his chair scraping against the linoleum. "But remember who you were. It made you strong enough to be who you are now." "I will." Jack stood too, extending his hand. After a moment's hesitation, Snake took it. "We're square," Snake said, loud enough for his men to hear. "No one comes looking. No one causes trouble." The tension in the diner dissolved like morning mist. Snake's men relaxed, and Rico, who'd been watching from the counter, smiled slightly. Jack watched them leave, the rumble of motorcycles fading into the distance. He sat back down, letting out a long breath. The waitress appeared with more coffee. "Everything okay, hun?" she asked. Jack nodded, a sense of peace settling over him. "Yeah, everything's okay." The morning sun filtered through the kitchen windows of their new home, casting warm patterns across the wooden table where Jack sat with his morning coffee. The house wasn't much, a modest 3-bedroom ranch on the outskirts of town, but it felt more like home than anywhere he'd lived before. Emma bustled around the kitchen, humming as she made breakfast. The smell of pancakes filled the air, mixing with the aroma of fresh coffee. Their father, still going by John, but working on legally reclaiming his old name, sat in the living room reading the newspaper, his reading glasses perched on his nose. "You're burning the edges," Jack pointed out, watching Emma flip a pancake. "I am not," she mock glared at him, Some of us like them a little crispy. Nobody likes burnt pancakes, sis. The word sis still felt new on his tongue, but it came easier each time. Emma's face lit up whenever he said it, just like it did now. Their father folded his newspaper and joined them in the kitchen. Something smells good. Burnt, Jack said, ducking as Emma threw a dish towel at him. You too? Their father chuckled, shaking his head. Reminds me of when you were little, Jack. You used to help your mother in the kitchen, always trying to tell her how to cook. Instead of the usual sting that came with mentions of his mother, Jack felt a gentle warmth. The past didn't hurt as much anymore. Emma set plates in front of them, loaded with slightly crispy but not burnt pancakes. She'd drawn silly faces on them with whipped cream and berries. There, now you can't complain because they're smiling at you. Jack laughed, really laughed, the sound filling the kitchen. It struck him then, how natural this felt, how right. The morning light, the breakfast table, his sister's terrible cooking, their father's quiet presence. I got the job at the local garage, their father announced between bites. Starting Monday. That's great, Dad, Emma beamed. Pretty soon we'll have 3 working members in this household, Jack added. He'd started at a construction company 2 weeks ago, and Emma had her job at the library. Speaking of work, Emma said, we should celebrate. Maybe have a proper housewarming? Invite some of the neighbors? A year ago, the idea of neighbors and housewarming parties would have seemed absurd to Jack. Now it felt possible. Normal, even. Yeah, he said. We should. After breakfast, Jack and Emma sat on the back porch, watching the morning unfold. Birds hopped across their small yard, and somewhere in the distance, a lawnmower hummed. Remember when we first met? Emma asked, her coffee cup cradled in her hands. You looked ready to throw me out of that diner. I was, Jack admitted. Couldn't believe anyone could have news about Dad. Couldn't believe I had a sister. Emma smiled, reaching over to squeeze his hand. And now? Jack looked at their joined hands, then at the peaceful backyard, and finally at the house where their father was washing dishes. Something so ordinary, it almost made him want to cry. Now I can't imagine not having this, he said softly. Having you, having Dad back, having a real family. Emma leaned her head against his shoulder, a gesture that had become familiar and comforting. We found something pretty special, didn't we? Yeah, Jack agreed, watching a pair of birds build a nest in their maple tree. We really did. The evening settled softly around their small home, painting the sky in gentle strokes of pink and orange. Jack sat on the porch steps, his father and Emma beside him. A light breeze carried the scent of blooming flowers from Emma's newly planted garden. Remember when I used to take you fishing, Jack? Their father asked, his voice carrying a hint of nostalgia. You were so impatient, always wanting to reel in the line too soon. Jack smiled, remembering those rare, peaceful moments from his childhood. Yeah, and you'd always say, patience is the key to everything. He glanced at his weathered hands, hands that had known too much violence. Guess I didn't learn that lesson very well back then. Emma nudged his shoulder gently. But you learned it eventually. That's what matters. The setting sun cast long shadows across their yard, where wind chimes tinkled softly from the porch roof. Jack watched a pair of cardinals flit between trees, their red feathers bright against the darkening sky. The scene before him was so different from the dingy bars and dangerous streets he'd known for so long. Sometimes, Jack said, breaking the comfortable silence, I still can't believe how much has changed. A few months ago I was... He trailed off, not wanting to voice the darkness of his past. Their father placed a hand on his shoulder. We've all changed, son. That's the beauty of second chances. Jack remembered the anger that had consumed him when Emma first appeared in that diner. The distrust, the bitterness, the walls he'd built around his heart. Now, sitting here with his sister and father, those emotions felt like distant echoes. "You know what I think about sometimes?" Emma said, pulling her knees up to her chest. "That first morning we had breakfast together. You looked at me like I was going to disappear any second." "I was scared," Jack admitted, the words coming easier now. "Scared to believe in anything good." Their father shifted in his chair, the wood creaking softly. "We were all scared. Fear kept us apart for too long. But look at us now." Jack looked around at their modest home, at the quiet street where neighbors waved as they passed by. No more looking over his shoulder, no more violence lurking around every corner. The weight of his past had lifted, replaced by something lighter, something hopeful. "I never thought I'd have this," Jack said, his voice soft but steady. "A real home, a family." Emma leaned against him, her presence warm and reassuring. "You always had a family, Jack. We just had to find our way back to each other." The last rays of sunlight painted their faces in golden hues as Jack absorbed the truth of her words. His journey from darkness to light hadn't been easy, but sitting here, surrounded by love he'd once thought impossible, he knew it had been worth every step. "You know what?" Jack said, watching as the first stars appeared in the twilight sky. "For the first time in my life, I'm not running from anything. I'm not fighting against the world. I'm just here, and it feels right." Their father smiled, the lines around his eyes crinkling with genuine joy. "That's because you're home, son. We all are." Jack looked at his sister and father, feeling the deep sense of peace that had finally taken root in his heart. The violent life he'd known seemed like a distant memory now, replaced by the simple beauty of family dinners, shared laughter, and quiet evenings like this one. The porch light flickered on automatically as darkness settled in, casting a warm glow over their little family gathering. In that gentle light, Jack saw his future clearly, not as a Hell's Angel, but as a brother, a son, and a man who had found his way back to love.